Spencer. I'm a faculty member in the Earth Commons, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to yet another stellar event with special guests from our extended family and community who graciously agree to share cutting-edge research and things that they're interested in and working on, which connect to the things we all care about on this beautiful blue marble, which is kind of a play on the title of the talk we'll hear today. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all here to the Eco Talk sponsored by the Earth Commons, and in particular to be able to share this outstanding colleague with you, Dr. Marisa Enzer, who I've known for many years and have found incredible overlap and collaboration with around shared themes that cut across the social sciences and environmental sciences and studies. And I've always been amazed and inspired by the depth and breadth of your work, how many places you connect the local, the micro, the contextual with the big picture, and how you pivot so seamlessly between that. It's not easy to do that, and I commend you for that. That's just anecdotal. I have a more formal bio that I'll synopsize in just a moment. Just a couple of quick announcements in case I forget them on the back end. One is that after this, there'll be a reception one floor up on the 8th floor, so please join us for that. And in 2 weeks, we'll be delighted to welcome another outstanding colleague, Dr. David Schiffman, also known as the Shark Guy, to come and talk with us about the causes and consequences of public misunderstanding of shark conservation. So 2 weeks, same time, same channel, right in this room. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Marisa Enzer, who's an affiliate researcher and lecturer at the Earth Commons and a climate security specialist with a background in the socio-environmental dimensions of climate change, environmental disasters, insecurity, and displacement. Dr. Enzer combines science, environmental anthropology, and rights-based approaches, examining intersectional, indigenous, and local perspectives on culture-nature interactions. She recently completed a participatory multidisciplinary project on climate change adaptation in 15 communities in 5 countries across the world. I think the number is even higher than that, actually, which we'll talk about today in your presentation, focusing on the co-identification of context-specific solutions. The co-identification of context-specific solutions. I'd love to hear you unpack that as you get into the talk. The critical linkages between water are a vital dimension of this larger project. She's currently expanding with additional locations. Dr. Enzer holds a PhD in environmental anthropology from the University of Florida, an LLB LLM in international law and human rights law from the University of Essex in the UK, and a graduate certificate in forced migration studies from the University of Oxford, also in the UK. And in today's talk, Dr. Enzer will share with us a bit of the work that's emerging in her book by the same eponymous title, Promoting Blue Resilience, based on 15 years of field work in over 25 countries across the globe. You've done field work in more countries than I've visited, basically, which is amazing.
31.
Yes.
Not 31.
31 and counting. Okay, it'll be 32 by the time the talk is over. The talk explores how some of the key ongoing and emerging issues affecting coastal communities' efforts to adapt to climate change help focus our interest and attention around the critical resource of water. The findings advance the argument that our blue planet's resilience to the changing climate is best understood and promoted at the nexus of freshwater, ocean, and climate. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Marisa Enzer.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and thank you, Randall, for that introduction. Given such a flattering introduction and the brilliant synopsis you've given of my book, I think I might just go.
We're done? Okay, we'll see you on the 8th floor.
I don't think I can do any better than that. All right, so as Randall said, as Professor Amster said, I am primarily an environmental anthropologist. Yep. That is someone who studies how natural systems and human systems interact. I have several other titles, as you mentioned as well, but for the purposes of this presentation, I will keep my environmental anthropology hat firmly on, right? And yes, I have so far worked in 31 countries and counting. I've been doing this for quite a long time. All gorgeous countries, even if for the most part, there were conflict and disaster from countries. But after all, I specialize in human environmental relations in crisis situations. So this was by design. All right, well, what I would like to do today is share with you some highlights of my upcoming book of the same title. And let's see how this goes. All right. The blue part of the Blue Resilience title is a reflection of the premise that the climate crisis is a water crisis. For human beings, the most ubiquitous and immediate way in which we experience the consequences of climate change are water related, okay? Including both floods and droughts, increasingly variable and unpredictable precipitation patterns, sea level rise, coastal erosion, salinization, saltwater intrusion into the freshwater table, and so forth. This importance of water and climate is the case everywhere, but I would argue that particularly so in coastal communities, in coastal regions, and liminal areas between land and the ocean. So, land, freshwater, coasts, and the ocean are connected through the water cycle. Okay? The adverse consequences of climate change in one place can have and often have profound consequences both upstream and downstream if we're using a risk as a metaphor. Okay? Conversely, what I'm calling blue resilience could be defined as the ability to more effectively and equitably, I like to highlight equitably, mitigate, withstand, and recover from, and adapt to climate-driven hydrometeorological coastal hazards, as the majority of them are. Okay? So I realize that this is a broad conceptual definition, and the multiple and interrelated ways in which resilience manifests itself on the ground is, of course, context specific. Okay? So although I have conducted fieldwork in 31 countries, my book is not a collection of case studies. Instead, I use findings from my fieldwork as illustrations of the larger themes that I discuss in the book. Okay, my approach is always ethnographic in the sense that the findings come from my experience on the ground working with the affected local communities. The case study that I'm, not the case study, but the example that I'm going to use here as a primary case study was team-based. That is my my research team. Okay, let's see. Okay, those are the methods that I used, not just in this particular case study, but in all of the other contexts that are included in the Blue Resilience larger project. I'm not going to go into any further detail describing or explaining the various methods. That would take me an entire semester. In fact, it does take me an entire semester. I recognize some of my students from that course. So I would imagine that most of these methods are familiar to you. Okay? But I'll be happy to discuss them later. I'm planning on speaking for maybe 30 to 40 minutes, depending on how fast I go. And that should give us plenty of time afterwards for discussion and Q&A. Having said that, if you have any burning question as I speak, feel free to interrupt me and ask me now. If something is not clear, don't just sit there suffering in silence, because if something is not clear, it might prevent you from following along, and we don't want that. All right. So, see. So co-generating field data that you were curious about. Okay. Every step of the project, and that involved traveling to the sites that I'm going to discuss next slide multiple times, the first time for 9 weeks. Every aspect of it was discussed and approved of with members from the local communities. Okay, so it's a community-based participatory action research, but not just in terms of the generation of the data, but also they approve the reports that are resulted from it, because the idea was to submit the reports with a number of recommendations and requests to not just the community authorities, but the government authorities in Senegal for projects to be actually implemented. So my project was in terms of understanding the projects that were implemented based on that understanding is something that I wanted to be very. The data is disaggregated by gender, generation, and ethnic group. So there I am doing a focus group with, I work with women and single men, because if men are not married, they do not count as adult men, and therefore they go with the women. So I was working again with women and single men. I had a male counterpart who was the other co-researcher, the other study participant, and he worked with the adult men, meaning the married men, regardless of chronological age. Chronological age is important here. Okay? They themselves presented the findings to the rest of the community for approval. And together, I would write them on a board. And I do this to ensure that study participants who may be illiterate, and especially among the women, and especially among the older women, many of them were in that situation. And so that shows, let me see, that is problem 3. The idea is that sometimes the problems that are more immediately visible are the result of root problems, root causes that we need to investigate. And so that allowed them to begin the thinking process on cause and effect on the main problems that they themselves identified. So I was writing it on the board myself, but I was constantly saying it out loud so that those who were not able to read it in French, they do speak French, they could still follow. So again, co-generating data by engaging the study participants at every step of the project. And in fact, the project had been requested by them through a local NGO. It was funded by a consortium of UN organizations. That's why we have the possibility of submitting the results to the government, requesting a number of interventions, some of which are already underway. Okay. If you have more questions about the co-generation, I'm happy to try and answer. All right. Okay, so. And now I would like to introduce you to one of my study participants. Okay? We're going to call her Madame Awa. Madame Awa is not her real name. I never use in my publications or in my public presentations the real name of my study participants, even when they give their consent. Okay. Awa, however, would be a very common name for a woman of the Jola ethnic group to which she belongs. Okay. So the Jola are a minority ethnicity in Senegal. They constitute between 4 and 5. The census is not entirely reliable, but between 4 and 5, a tiny percentage of the total population. And the majority of them live in this region, in Bas Casamance, which is where the research is taking place. Okay. So Madame Awa is a pêcheuse d'huîtres. She is an oyster gatherer or oyster harvester, something she proclaims with a large measure of pride, okay, for reasons that will become clearer as we go along. Okay. So something else to know about the Jola is that they're primarily animist. That is, they believe that every element in nature is animated by spirit and therefore needs to be treated with dignity and respect. That is, in a sustainable manner. Might be a difference between beliefs and actions, but those are the beliefs. Okay. They also consider mostly non-hierarchical, especially compared to some of the other ethnic groups living in the region. And although they are formally patriarchal, in the sense that the head of the household is automatically understood to be the man, women occupy a relatively high position, both economically and culturally, in Jola society. And that position is actually increasing, which are kind of unusual findings compared to research that I've done in other parts of the world. Okay. The two main livelihood strategies are rice cultivation and fishing, which includes oyster harvesting. All right, and we can talk about the gender division of labor if you're interested with respect to rice cultivation. Everyone in the household participates, but in different genders and different ages are in charge of different kinds of activities. Fishing, if it's within what they call bolong, the mangrove tidal area, that can be done by the women as well. If it's offshore, that's mostly done by the men in men control, that kind of fishing. And women are increasingly engaging in oyster harvesting for reasons that I will talk about in a second. What is this? Okay. All right. Okay, so this is the region. Okay. That's a map of Senegal, obviously. The Casamance is a river. And so the lower Casamance, or Bas Casamance, is the part of the territory that's closer to the ocean, the lower part of the ocean. Okay? That region, the entire region of Casamance, if you notice, is the part of Senegal that is south of the Gambia. The country has a kind of a new geography. And so Casamance is geographically, as well as culturally and ethnically, separate from the rest of the country by the Gambia. The official European language in Senegal is French. They speak English in the Gambia. And the only way to travel from Casamance to the rest of the country, including Dakar, the capital, is by going around it. You can fly, but it is prohibitively expensive for someone from the region. Most people don't have a car. In fact, there are no cars on the islands where I was doing most of my research. And so they have always felt to be isolated from the rest of the country, which they appreciated in some regards, in the sense that they are not interested in being culturally integrated with the rest of the society, because the rest of the country, the majority ethnic group, is completely different. They're called the Wolof. The Jola speak Jola. They're animists. The Wolof speak Wolof. They are primarily agro-pastoralists. They are having their own problems with blue resilience, although in their case is less coastal and more in terms of very severe water insecurity. I discussed that in the book as well, and we can do it during Q&A if you want, but it's not part of the presentation. Okay? So they felt both protected in that regard, but also isolated. Okay? And that has caused problems over time that I will talk. Okay. Here. All right. That is one of the three main islands. They're about half an hour from the shore by motorized pirogue or canoe. And when talking about her home, the islands, Madame Awa always mentions that they are paradise, that they are the most beautiful place in the world, which she absolutely believes, even though she has never been anywhere else in the world. But I mean, you must agree that they're really beautiful. To me, the most beautiful part, what I enjoyed the most was at night. They have almost every night, cases of bioluminescence, which is unrelated to my project, but it was just gorgeous. So every night, after we were, and when I say night, I mean more like 5 or 6, there's no electricity. And so the moment it gets dark, there's nothing else to be done. And that means that the skies are gorgeous. You see all the stars. And the water, which feels like a jacuzzi, is covered by this gorgeous, you know this already, gorgeous layer of bioluminescence. I attempted multiple times to take a photograph, but I just got a bluish blur. So I think you know what I mean by bioluminescence. That was my favorite part. And that, yeah, indeed, they are paradise. Okay. So Caravan and the other 2 islands, they're called Nimun and Yoge. They're beautiful, but immediately after telling me that her home is paradise, she also tells me that paradise is sinking and we have to do anything we can to prevent that from happening. Okay. So they are experiencing both chronic sea level rise, punctuated by more acute episodes of, they call them monster storms. So the tide comes up much higher than is typically the case and remains high for an unusually long period, and then never goes back to the original level. Okay? So that at the bottom on the left, that used to be a cemetery. Yeah. And so they tell me that one morning they woke up to see the cemetery completely washed away and bodies floating on the water. And some of them, and those that were floating, they try to retrieve them because it's very much part of their belief and something it was important for them. But the ones that were washed away and irretrievable, those were an irretrievable loss. So they are much more upset about the fact that the cemetery was washed away than about the fact that several other buildings, in fact, entire villages have been destroyed. Okay? But as they said, we can rebuild the school, which they actually did because it's a very simple structure and they can be rebuilt in a week or less. But the cemetery, their ancestors cannot be retrieved. Okay? Something perhaps more problematic in instrumental terms as opposed to in cultural or ideological terms is the fact that rice cultivation is becoming increasingly difficult. Yeah? Since sea level rise has been happening for decades, they've been noticing it since the 70s at least. That is something that everybody in the community knows very well. I don't know if it is because there's few things going on. The things that are happening are very much burning everybody's memory. So Madame Jola, not Jola, Awa was very precise in the sequence of events, even if unable to tell me the specific year when things were happening. Okay, so based on other things that had happened around the 70s, I mean, that's how I came to the conclusion that she meant the 70s, plus all of this has been recorded by scientists. So she was very, very accurate. Okay? So she mentioned how difficult it had become for her husband and her 5 adult children, all of whom are males, to do what men are supposed to do. Because without being able to demonstrate an ability to support a household, they were having a hard time getting married. And if they are not married, regardless of how old they are chronologically, they are not considered men. They are not considered having transitioned into social manhood, which is required to transition into social adulthood. So it's really, really problematic. It's not just a matter of not being able to eat rice. Rice, I mean, the other grain could be imported, but it doesn't fulfill the requirement of being able to demonstrate that as men, they're able to do it for their households, for their families. Okay, and so these levees that have been traditionally used to protect the rice paddies from the at first gradual rising sea levels, they are no longer equally effective. And so they are very worried about that. So, estimates from the local university, which is in the mainland, not on the islands, are that since they started keeping records in the last about decade or so, one of the islands, the one that lost the cemetery, that's in Yogi, has lost approximately 15 hectares of land, considering that it's a tiny island. Okay? I don't recall exactly what the diameter is, but I was able to walk all around it and come back for lunch. So it is pretty small. So losing 15 hectares is a tremendous proportion of the total site. Okay. And as I said, it is making rice cultivation very difficult, which is not just a primary livelihood strategy, but very much part of their identity as Jola. Among other things, because other neighboring ethnic groups, including the Wolof, they plant different kinds of grain. And so the rice cultivators are the Jola. If they cannot do this, it's chipping away at their identity. So rice cultivation forms the basis for their ritual as well as their livelihood calendar, which they have been following for as long as they can remember, and it's becoming increasingly difficult. So right now they're not experiencing food insecurity. That is not the problem. It's mainly the cultural component of it that is being affected. So one interesting thing in that regard in terms of how they combine the cultural and survival dimensions of their livelihood, is the importance that birds in their culture in the islands. Almost everybody is able to make predictions as to how the weather is going to change on the basis of bird behavior, the basis of the species that are present or absent, on whether they are on the islands or going back and forth between the islands and the mainland, and how they behave. Okay? It's typically the men who are associated with these skills, the ones who learn these skills more formally, although it's through storytelling. But almost everybody very much values birds for this particular purpose. They don't kill them and eat them. Okay? They think that, based on their animistic ideas, birds are very spiritual beings because they can fly, and that they bring those messages to those who are Jola enough to be able to interpret the messages. Okay? And that the fact that the predictability on which they relied upon in the past is being affected as well, it is a reason for severe sadness. They're very sad about the fact that the birds are not acting anymore the way they always have, or especially for the elders in the Council of Elders, part of their respect that they garner for the rest of the community is their ability to be able to read these signs. And if they are no longer able to do it, they fear that the younger generations might not be able to respect them because they are not performing their roles as they were supposed to. But yeah, there was quite a lot of talk about birds, and I'm not going to mention the names because they didn't know the names in French, and they were mentioning the Jola names, which I don't speak. So anyway, birds kept being mentioned. I think that Pete would like that place. All right. And it's okay for the birds to eat the rice, although I hear that it's not good for them. They can eat other grains. Okay, so as rice has become increasingly problematic, something they have always done, but they have attempted to emphasize more, is fishing, right? And again, this is an area where both culture and survival come together. Those are the traditional Senegalese pirogue, which are dugout canoes. They are their primary means of transportation. But the design, the symbolism includes messages that are important for them. And sometimes that is how they send a message to the other islands or to the mainland. This kind of artisanal fishing is becoming also harder as time goes by, because as a result of ocean heat waves, the temperature of the ocean has been increasing. And the primary species of pelagic fish on which they rely, which is called round sardinella, okay, is now much further north than it used to be, looking for colder temperatures. And so it is increasingly difficult for fishermen, and I'm saying men because they are male, to capture as many fish as they did in the past because, well, according to studies by the local university that I was mentioning, as well as a number of NGOs who are working in the area, the bulk of the sardinella are now 180 kilometers further north. There's no way that they can reach 180 kilometers away from the islands and those pirogues. Not to mention that they are also competing with industrial fishing and trawling. primarily from Europe. And many of them, surprisingly, or at least I found it surprising, from Spain, which is a very fishing country that has tons of fish on their own. Why did they have to go and fish the fish that belongs to Senegal? Now, I don't know if you've seen the images of boats from Africa attempting to arrive the southern coast of Europe on the west. I'm not talking about the ones that arrive in Greece, but the ones who arrive to the west, like in southern Spain. Okay. That's where they are coming from. If you look at the map, the Canary Islands, for instance, they are directly north. So that is where the Sardinella are going. Spanish fishing boats are capturing the fish and then complaining that the people from Senegal who have lost an important component of their livelihood strategy are migrating out of this region. Okay? Most of those who are migrating are actually not from the islands. Okay? They're from Senegal, but not from the islands. They are much more focused on maintaining their culture at all costs. So they're still working on improving the conditions of the islands. Okay. Right. So their data begins in the 1960s. Okay, I was able to compare the timeline that they told me with the scientific data. And as I said, even when they didn't mention the specific years, they mentioned a very specific sequence of different events. And that most people who, like Madame Awa, are old enough to have heard about it. I mean, I believe she was in her 50s. Chronology was not very important for them, but she would not have been alive. But she remembers hearing about it. And she tells me that fishing, what they call bolon fishing, close to the island, was organized as a household activity with both women and men jointly engaged in the activity. And it wasn't until the 70s and the 80s when a sharp decline in rainfall, see, everything is related, require significant livelihood adjustments. Okay? So climate change and droughts contributed to not just water insecurity, and they need to be constantly re-digging the wells. So the digging of the wells is a male activity, but the carrying of the water is a female activity. But the soil became increasingly salty, and their favorite variety of rice is not drought resistant or salt resistant. So they, for a long time, they reduced their rice production. And that led them to an increased exploitation of the mangroves, which up until the 80s or so, was seen as kind of a complementary activity, as opposed to a central component of their livelihood. Okay, and mangrove oyster harvesting is considered female activity. Again, something they did on the side. And that is very harsh work. I mean, that is what it looks like. It is also quite dangerous because most of them don't know how to swim. Okay, well, I am a pretty good swimmer. In fact, I'm a diver. But if I had to go in the water dressed up like they do, with a long, narrow skirt, which is really something, wrapped around my legs, I don't know how well I would do. So it is hard work. It is dangerous. It is, however, a preferred activity for women, because Madame Agua reminded me, land in Jola culture is communally owned by the community, but controlled by men. It is never to be sold unless in extreme circumstances, and only by consultation and approval, unanimous approval by all married men, which are the only ones that count. Okay, women are not consulted in any decisions having to do with land tenure. That is the one arena in which the patriarchal nature of Jola society is manifested. In most other respects, is more egalitarian, but not with respect to land tenure, or they have access to it. They're able to work the rice paddies. They have access, but not control over. They would not be able to control the benefits. Okay. And as Madame Agua reminded me, that applies to the land, but not to the water. Okay. Mother Ocean is free. And so they are able to avail themselves of any resources in the mangroves or in the ocean that they're able to access as they see fit. And they're also able to control the profits. And so two things started happening at the same time. Both rice cultivation became more difficult. Okay. Fishing also became more difficult. And the one activity that was still possible was to be, men could have, but because it is associated with women and it was initially defined as, something that women do on the side, they were not particularly interested. And so women took over and they claim it as, this is what we do. Hence, what I mentioned at the beginning, that Madame Agua pronounced that she was an oyster harvester with so much pride, because over time she has become the de facto head of her household, which is an entire lineage. Right. Okay. The fact that they were being so successful as not only harvesters, but also marketers of it, gave them the idea that maybe they could do something else. And so they're increasingly engaged in an activity that they call maraîchage, which is like kitchen gardening. In the past, the little plot of land adjacent to their houses was managed by the women, and they would plant vegetables for household consumption, because a side activity that women do. But they have demonstrated that they're good at both initially bartering, but also marketing. Okay, and so they have come together in cooperatives and associations of women oyster harvesters, and since traveling back and forth between the islands and the mainland for them individually would be too expensive, even though it's like $3, but it's a lot of money for them. They've come together in cooperatives, and they've identified intermediaries to help them do this. And that once they realized that the intermediaries were eating up their benefits, so their profit, they designated a woman who was brave enough to be the one to go back and forth and sell all the oysters for the rest of the community, as opposed to all of the women doing it, because that is cheap. And that was Madame Agua, which is why I started working with her. Okay, so illiterate, in her 50s, which is considered like an elderly woman by Jola standards. Not any prior knowledge of how to do this. They had done it. She tells me that she had done it as a child, as a fun thing to do. But now she is the leader of a cooperative that is responsible for the economic survival of the entire community, granted a very small community, and that they're using those profits to make other kinds of improvements. Not to mention that the cultural status, the social status of women in general has rapidly increased. And I was particularly pleased with these findings because in most other contexts, it tended to be the opposite. Women's vulnerability had been negatively affected by, rather than blue resilience, which is what I'm choosing it would have been blue vulnerability. Then again, resilience and vulnerability are not mutually exclusive, and it's perfectly possible, indeed common, to be both vulnerable and resilient. And I'm told that I am running out of time, which is bummer. All right. Okay, I've already said this. Oyster harvesting is a central statement in the blue resilience to the impact of the changing climate. All right. So as I mentioned, once the results of this project, which included many more components than what I am discussing here, one thing that I haven't mentioned is that in 1982, there was a group of separatists that declared war against, from Casamance, declared war against the government in Dakar. A civil war took place. Thousands of people were killed. Many more were displaced. Infrastructure was destroyed. Rice paddies were destroyed as well, increasing food insecurity. And in fact, the majority of those who died of food insecurity and disease rather than in battle. Okay, at the beginning of the 2000s, several peace agreements have been signed, but they are more cessation of hostility agreements than actual comprehensive peace agreement, which is why the conflict has morphed into a low kind of insecurity. People continue dying because they have not been, this disarmament hasn't taken place. Okay, so there's been an official demobilization, but not disarmament. And so the area remains rather dangerous in that regard. The last peace agreement, such as it was, that was signed, was in, I believe in early 2025. When I was there, nothing happened. And I have actually worked in conflict zones. I didn't see anything at all. Anyway, let me see. Okay, so that sign is, I translated here. So strengthening the resilience of female seafood processors in UK Island. It specifies the female ones. Okay? The word transformatrice is for feminine. All right, and if you can read what it says on the top, that is a project supporting the National Action Plan, on climate change from Senegal. So it is kind of a big deal. Each of the islands had something similar, but this is the only one that had a sign that I could take a photograph of. They are supporting women so that they can continue with the oyster harvesting, and especially the marketing part of it, which is more complicated for them. Right. Something else that the project is helping them with is continue something that they were already doing, which is using primarily local materials, but for some reason also tires that have been brought to them from the mainland, because as I said, they have no cars. Okay, they're creating these groins And that is what they look like. They are very low-tech efforts to keep sea level rise at bay. And I wasn't there long enough to be able to verify by myself that they were indeed gaining terrain. But apparently they're being very, very effective. Okay. It seems that I have 1 minute left. So I am quickly going, okay, these are the findings from a more theoretical point of view. What I mean by the source to sea continuum and what I said before about the importance of considering the entire water cycle as one unit, as opposed to, how the ocean on the one hand and fresh water on the other hand is affecting them. Okay. Findings also supported the premise that disaster, it should be the, no. What have I done? Help. Okay, I can speak. So another finding is the importance of integrating disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation initiatives. It shouldn't be DDR, and that is a disaster. Disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, which is also important because they had a lot of child soldiers. But here I actually meant DRR, like the second. All right. Again, in most of the places where I've done this research, but particularly in coastal areas, and not just in Senegal, this is in Antigua, which is another one of the countries, another one of the gorgeous, the paradisiac countries. The distinction between the impacts of climate change and disasters is completely theoretical, and people on the ground don't really, they talk about them in an integrated manner. Those of us who are in academia for heuristic purposes have a tendency to discuss these things in silos, but people on the ground experience it in an integrated manner. And this is the last one. The importance of intersectional blue resilience. I always say that communities, especially for those who do community-based participatory action research, communities may be the locus, the ideal locus of research, but they're not the right unit of analysis. Data needs to be disaggregated by whatever variables are significant, whatever access of social differentiation impact people's ability to access the necessary resources that they would need, including decision-making power. Okay. So in the case of Casamance, it was primarily gender and age, not so much ethnicity because they were all Jola. And so it was, ethnicity was not available because it didn't vary. But in other places where I've worked, that would have been very important. And finally, I want us to go back to Casamance, where the rest of the findings are referenced to. And see here. So last time I spoke with Madame Awa. She told me that she was worried. She was proud of herself because of how much her work had contributed to improving the conditions of her household, her lineage, especially women. But they worry that in spite of all the efforts they are making, it is possible that as sea level rise increases, as climate change becomes more severe, as every one of the factors that I have been discussing continues to be more frequent and more severe, there might be a time when retreat to the mainland may be inevitable. But she believes that everything they are doing is delaying that moment, and if that happens, they will deal with it. But for the time being, she believes that herself and her women, as she says, are with women at the helm, that's my phrase, not hers. The blue resilience of the people of Casamance is, if not guaranteed, at least strengthened. And I'm happy to have been able to witness their process and being able to transmit all of these findings to those who are in a position to implement projects on the ground that are helping them to do what they want to do, just with additional assistance. So yeah, that is what I wanted to share with you, and I'm happy to answer questions if I can.
Thanks, Dr. Inzer. We have time for a couple of questions. I just want to say, knowing your work over the years and seeing how you do this, it's easy sometimes in the face of a global emergency to scale up too quickly, to miss the deep context of the cases and the communities that you interact with. So I really appreciate you unpacking that. For us, the nuances matter and the details matter, and we don't get to an intersectional approach without understanding that. And this is one case among many. And I'd be interested for you to share at some point, if not in this context, but in the future, how you assemble all of the information across and among and between all those disparate cases. That's just more of a meta question that, that I think about as well, with community being the scale, but not the only way that we approach these things.
You mean how the communities were chosen?
No, more so that when you discern the lessons you take about blue resilience from the cases that you explore, how you compare and contrast them in order to bring forth principles or lessons that we could draw from in other contexts, like how they start to aggregate, even though the cases are all disaggregated.
Okay. Well, one thing that I always try to do is to distinguish between the why, the what, and the how. Okay, so the why tends to be very similar across case studies. The reasons why some of these problems are taking place tend to be very similar. The what is what is actually happening, and there tends to be certain similarities, but you identify trends and patterns, and you see the relationship between different kinds of livelihood strategies or different kinds of social organization, different kinds of different things, and the corresponding result. But then the how people are being impacted by it and how they are responding to it, that is very, very context specific. And I think it would be problematic to try and come up with, a blueprint that we might want to try and impose all across, because I think the richness of the research that I do is precisely the ability to work in a multi-scalar. Let me say that right. So that findings are both helpful at the government level, who are the ones who are going to make the decisions and implement the projects, this in this case, but also locally responsive to the conditions that they themselves identify. Okay? Now, that sounded like I have this clear plan. On the ground, things are significantly messier, but I always try to do things in a co-generated manner, so that they are the ones who tell me this is the way we see things, this is what we want, and we go from there.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that very much. So let's open it up. We started a little bit late, so we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Inzer, for talking to us about this. It's super interesting and it's really the right perspective. I was curious, going back to your point about the sort of fishing, the industrial fishing that's occurring outside of Senegal, that's kind of affecting some of these communities. It's kind of a pattern I've been noticing where a lot of these wealthier industrial fishing countries are exploiting their own marine resources in order to exploit other resources. Do you know if these countries or these vessels have fishing licenses with Senegal, or if they're fishing outside the exclusive economic zone of Senegal, or if they're kind of participating in this illegal fishing?
Well, quite recently, and I think 2024, Senegal enacted a law requiring foreign vessels operating within a certain distance from Senegalese waters to have a particular kind of fishing license. And on paper, it was praised as being exactly what needed to be done. The problem is enforcement and even monitoring of it. And so those I have spoken with tell me that some difference has been noticed, some improvement has been noticed, but not nearly as much as it would be required for it to make a really meaningful difference. I heard something similar in the east coast of Africa, which is actually where I tend to do most of my work. This was my first West African country. I've worked in Chad, but that's in the middle, and it's not coastal. So yeah, speaking, if I were to put my international law hat on, I would say that that piece of legislation was a major legal success. But if it's not implemented, and even in those cases in which it has been proven that the treaty has been violated, nothing happens. It's a piece of law that has no teeth, as they say. But I prefer to think of it as a positive step, as a step in the right direction, even if it isn't enough. At least it's evidence of the recognition that that is a problem and that something needs to be done. Okay, and I think it was January 17th, the High Seas Treaty was finally coming into effect. Again, is it going to be implemented on the ground? Well, I need to write a spotlight on it.
Thank you so much.
So yeah, did I answer your question?
Yeah,
wish
I think
had
so. Yeah.
more concrete and optimistic news to report, but yeah, they have the law. Thank you. Yeah.
Any time for that? Yes.
I was wondering, since oyster harvesting is becoming a focal economic activity for these islands, if there are concerns of overexploiting this resource now that so many women are involved.
It doesn't seem to be the case for the time being. In fact, what is happening is that because the only oysters they are able to reach are the ones on the mangroves, they are monitoring that mangroves are not being destroyed to replace the area with rice paddies. So I suppose overexploitation over time might be a concern. For the time being, what's happening is that they're protecting the mangroves. One thing they are concerned about, though, is that as the sea level rises, the oysters, if they remain at the same level, so to speak, if they are way too deep, they might not be able to reach them because they can't swim. It is dangerous. But it doesn't appear, I haven't seen any evidence or haven't heard anyone mention it, that is happening, but I see why that might be the case over time. And this is relatively recent. So yeah.
Any time for one more?
Hi, thank you for speaking with us. I had a question about if you were speaking to an individual or an organization about to start a similar kind of community level coastal adaptation research project, what is one piece of advice or one element of their project that you would encourage them to prioritize that you think is underexplored in these types of projects?
Actually, I don't think that I would encourage the NGO to prioritize anything in particular. I would ask them to understand what the community themselves is prioritizing. And because in my experience, I think it requires a degree in anthropology or any other. When local people themselves, who are the ones who are experiencing whatever is it that they are experiencing, identify this as their priority, the likelihood that a solution proposed to address that problem be accepted, buy-in, is much higher. Now, there are cases in which the community knows that they're having a problem, but they don't really know what the causes of the problem is. Because they may be more technical, and you can work with them and always explain it in a way that is locally understandable. But I think that making that effort and not directly go to more technocratic approaches and say, well, this is really coastal engineering. They're illiterate. They are not going to understand. Well, make them understand. Okay, because I show you what the drawings look like, it doesn't require engineering to do that. And the women are participating as well because they want to make sure that it's suitable. That's it. So yeah, I understand that this kind of work requires going to the field, and the findings are, I think they are globally significant, but they're context specific. And so I see why someone whose approach is very technocratic would bark at the idea of first go to the community and understand what they want. Especially because, as I hopefully I did say that, I believe that communities are the right locus of the research, but not the right unit of analysis. Okay? There's no such thing as a homogeneous community. Yeah? Even a relatively non-hierarchical culture like the Jola, people are in different positions in society based on different axes of social differentiation. So it's not only go to the community, but make sure that your approach does not silence marginalized voices in the community that would only result in replicating or exacerbating patterns of discrimination that were already there. Yeah? So if someone with a very superficial understanding of the Jola culture that you can, I don't know, Google, Wikipedia or something like that, say, well, they're primarily rice cultivators, which is an activity controlled by men, and fisher folk, which is also primarily controlled by men because the women only fish close to the coast. Therefore, we're just going to focus on the men. They would have proposed a project that completely missed what is actually being done that is effective, which is the oyster harvesting, not to mention that it would have completely undone all the work that women have already put in, all the effort they had put in increasing their social status. So yeah, this work, in my opinion, produces the most specific context appropriate results, but it's harder to scale it unless you have many cases. So let's get the cases. Those of you who are students, finish your degree and go to the field and help out because there's plenty of work to do.